Welcome back to episode 3 of Say It Louder, the podcast where we speak the unspeakable and encourage victims and survivors to reclaim their voice. I'm your host, Selina Waterman-Smith. In episode 2, I finished up talking about some of the pressure that I was under in the Emirates after I reported my kidnapping and sexual assault. And while there was a police case, moving forward, there was a police investigation, and I knew that the men had been arrested, I was still under pressure from other departments to drop the case. So I had obviously had a travel ban and a spurious alcohol charge levied against me by a different group of powerful men within the court system. And that whole scenario was so bizarre because there's nothing on my criminal record and there is no record of that anywhere. So these men were able to fabricate this. And this is important because this wouldn't be the first time that I would push back against the UAE legal system, or the first time that I experienced abuse of power at the hands of men in that part of the world. I was also still running my business. I had an event company that I'd been running for nearly 10 years at the time. I'd been living in Dubai for 4 years. I had to keep working. I had to keep putting food on the table and a roof over my head. I didn't have any support. The British Embassy are not able to support any victims in cases. Their official stance is that they do not get involved in any legal cases. What they did do was give me a list of lawyers at the beginning, and they did send a translator to one of the court dates. But beyond that, if something like that happens to you in that part of the world, you are completely on your own. So not only are the legal system predisposed to turn on you, but there won't be any support from the British Embassy. And in my case, I found that most people that I confided in just drifted away. They didn't want to be involved, and that's also very common. Dubai is this city where everyone is living the good life, or everybody Western, I should say. People go there for the tax-free salaries and the beach clubs and the business class flights with Emirates, which of course are fab. And people are less inclined to get involved in problems. And that's not everybody. I have lots of good friends there that are actively involved in charity work as much as they can do around the UAE's lack of charity laws. And there are lots of people that do animal rescue and try genuinely to help others. But in my case, I found it so difficult because most people just drifted away from me and turned on me. And you're probably wondering why the hell I even stayed in the country. Why would I put myself through this? Why didn't I just leave? But first and foremost, I am someone who believes in justice, and I believe in doing the right thing. And what those men did to me and all the other women is unacceptable. And I was prepared to put myself through whatever hell was necessary in order to get the result that I wanted to. And although I was terrified and had no idea if I was going to be arrested and jailed like all these other victims, I dug my heels in and I was determined to see it through. So after the travel ban was removed, I was able to continue working. We worked all over the Middle East, producing events. And I went back to the UK at Christmas time. It was my first Christmas without my dad, who was my last sort of close remaining family member. So it was a really sad Christmas. But I went back to England to volunteer at Crisis at Christmas, which is a homeless charity. And while I was there, I met people who were drug addicts and had been born into drug addict families, and they would probably never recover, never be rehabilitated, and essentially their cases were hopeless. And that really stuck out to me because it gave me some perspective on my situation, and it made me realize that despite the absolute hell that I was going through, my case was not hopeless. I had a fighting chance. I had a chance to get justice. And I did consider when I went back to England just not going back to the UAE. It was very tempting, but I've never run away from a fight or from a challenge. So that did renew my hope. I thought, I am getting somewhere. I have to go through hell first, but I am going to get somewhere with this. So I went back to the UAE. Again, as I said previously, I was really in the dark about the legal process. I did have a lawyer, but I didn't have any case details. I didn't know what was happening. I knew that 2 men had been arrested and charged, and a third man was on the run and the CID hadn't been able to catch him, which is unusual because the security and surveillance in that part of the world is so sophisticated. They can find anyone, anywhere, at any time if they want to. So I knew that there were multiple criminal cases, criminal court dates going ahead that I wasn't invited to or notified about. But around that time, I started being harassed by their families. So this was at the end of 2012. The assault happened in July 2012. I had the travel ban issue and the alcohol charge in November of that year. And I think it was around November that I started getting random phone calls from different numbers. And these men were Iranian. And it was different members of their family essentially harassing me and putting pressure on me to drop the case, which was also terrifying. It added another layer of pressure and another layer of complexity onto this situation. And I called the CID. I didn't have an official caseworker, but I did have the phone number of some of the CID guys. So I called them and said, these men are harassing me. And they said, oh, okay, well, that's something different. We don't work in that department. We're just handling the assault case and the kidnapping case. So we recommend that you go to the normal police station. And there is a perception about Dubai that because it's so safe, if you walk into a police station, you can report any crime and they'll take it seriously. And there's very strict laws to keep us all safe. But that's actually not true. It is almost impossible to get a police case opened, especially as a woman and especially as a Western woman. I don't know if it's cultural differences, complacency, or because it's not funded by tax. I have no idea. But most people that have lived in the UAE for a long time will acknowledge that if you walk into a police station, they will pretend that they don't speak English, or they'll send you away, or they'll make excuses, or they'll just leave you waiting for weeks until eventually you give up. So when I tried to report this harassment to the police, they said, what do you want us to do? There's already a criminal case happening against them. You're already getting the result you want. You just need to ignore them. And this is an example of how the legal system in that part of the world is not consistent. Because in the West, or certainly in England, witness intimidation is a crime. You're not allowed to do things like that, and it could inhibit justice being done. But there, apparently, it was perfectly acceptable. And for them to harass me for months was not a crime and not something that the police would investigate. So I'd been through this horrible trauma and assault, and then I had to deal with the families of the rapists telling me that I'm selfish, I'm ruining their lives, it was just a game that went wrong. And I really feel for any woman that has been through something similar, because the pressure is just relentless and never ending, and it's one trauma after another. The report, the police, the legal system, then the families that might start harassing you, and there's no support. There was no support for me. There was no counselling or therapy in the country at the time. It was extremely taboo. I tried to call charities in the UK for some sort of emotional support or maybe counselling, and they said, unfortunately, as you're a UAE resident, we actually can't support you in any way, shape or form. So it was terribly isolating, and trauma is isolating. Trauma separates you from the rest of the world. It puts you in a completely different sphere of existence. And I had to keep up this pretense and put on this mask every day that my life was wonderful and I was producing these events and everything was fine, while simultaneously dealing with a rape case in which I never knew if at any point I would be arrested and jailed. And that fear of being arrested and jailed, that is a legitimate fear. There are several notable cases where other rape victims have been arrested and jailed. One of them is a lady called Marta Dalev, who was a Norwegian lady who reported rape, and she was arrested and jailed. And because of public outcry and pressure from Western media outlets, she was actually given a royal pardon by Sheikh Mohammed. There was a case, I think the year after mine, with an Australian lady called Alicia Ghali, who was drugged and gang raped by her co-workers at a hotel that she was working at in Fujairah. And when she woke up the next day, she actually had broken bones, broken ribs from the assault. And she was arrested and jailed for 8 months. Can you imagine going through something like that and the men simply saying it was consensual, even when there are broken bones involved? And you as a victim, having gone through this trauma, are now sent to jail for 8 months. It's just unfathomable to me that victims are treated in this way. And I'm so fortunate that with my case, it went through to prosecution. And I think that there are multiple reasons for this. Firstly, that it is inconceivable for anyone to reframe what happened to me as not kidnapping and not rape, because it was so extreme. Again, I didn't know the details until I went to trial. But once I heard the testimonies from witnesses, I understood why. They realized there was no way to wiggle out of this and victim blame. Not that it's acceptable in any scenario to victim blame. And also in my case, the police knew that these men had multiple other victims. So it was perhaps for once in their interest to see these men prosecuted. Not necessarily in my interest, but definitely in the interest of Dubai and the UAE, protecting their image as a safe country. This is why the prosecution case moved forwards. So by 2013, I was actually required to attend court hearings, and the court hearings are different to how they are in other parts of the world. So there would be one day every 3 weeks dedicated to my case, and some days I was required to attend and some days I wasn't. And this was when I really got the full details about everything that happened, as well as going to court. Now, the day that I testified, I did have someone with me. There was a lady that ran a volunteer charity in the country who is no longer there. She had her own issues in the country as a charity worker. She attended with me, and there was a lawyer, a female lawyer, who'd reached out to me, who'd been really instrumental in giving me a lot of moral support. But they were the only people that came to any dates with me. No one from my friendship group came with me. And testifying was like walking into the jaws of hell. I had no idea what to expect. They did provide me with a translator, but it was scary stuff, even for someone like me that is generally quite fearless and quite bold. And it was one of the first times that I'd really talked about it in great depth. I hadn't shared all the details that I remembered with anyone, so I knew that it was going to open up this chasm of vulnerability. So when I walked into the courtroom, the judge had actually requested a closed courtroom, and I think this was to keep the British media out. The British media were already all over this case. They'd printed stories about me. They'd also been putting me under pressure, saying that if I didn't give them an exclusive, they were going to continue to print stories about me in a negative light, which I refused to give them an exclusive. So the judge kept the courtroom closed, I think, to keep the details of the case quiet, because again, the details potentially portrayed the region in a bad light rather than me. So the day that I testified, I remember walking into the courtroom, and nobody told me that the defendants, the two rapists, would be on my right-hand side. And I'd never seen them before. I didn't know what their names were. I just knew that they were Iranian men. And it was terrifying. I didn't look at them. I just looked straight ahead. I looked at the judge and the prosecution lawyer and the defense lawyer. And I think the interrogation in the court went on for a few hours, but I don't recall so much of it, I think, because I was so traumatized. And the first thing that they asked me was, tell us what happened that night. And I immediately just burst into tears, just hysterical tears. And I was saying, I can't talk about it. And of course I did. I gave them my testimony. And this makes me think about other victims who are not brave, or not that they're not brave. I don't want to put them down in any way, but maybe they're not strong enough. Maybe they were more traumatized than I was, and maybe they're not able to provide an articulate summary of events. And it kills me now to see rape victims in court and to hear judges and people from judicial systems say that they're not credible or reliable. When you are traumatized, it is very difficult to be reliable in the sense that you would expect your memory to be absolutely perfect. Very few people have ever dealt with the sheer panic that thinking your life is in danger makes you feel. It's shocking and parts of your brain shut down, you go into fight or flight mode. Expecting someone to have perfect recall of those memories is unfair, and it does such a disservice to victims. And in my case, I could barely remember anything. So I'm explaining this to the judge, and there were a few things that really stuck out to me. One of them was that the defense lawyer started trying to question me on what I was wearing that night. And this is a common tactic to shame and blame victims in court, as if a woman's clothing choice is somehow indicative of her desire to have sex. And if a woman is wearing a thong, this has been used as evidence, as defense evidence against a rape claim, that a young girl was wearing a thong when she went out that night. Therefore, she was clearly looking for sex, and she was not raped. So apparently we women, we go out with thongs and shaved legs and high heels and skirts on because we're looking for sex. And then when we've had sex, we regret it and we just fabricate a rape claim. It's absolutely nonsensical, and it's so damaging and disingenuous towards victims. However, the really shocking thing about the Dubai court is that when that lawyer started questioning me on this was immediately shut down by the judge, which I've never heard of such a thing. The judge literally said, and the translator told me, it's not relevant, move on to your next question. And I would like to campaign in future to make sure that a woman's style of dress is not acceptable evidence as a defense for a rape claim, because it really has no bearing on the case. Rape cases should be about facts and things that actually happened. And what you were wearing is nothing to do with a woman's mindset. You have no idea whether a woman was looking for sex or not. That is completely circumstantial. So I was really pleased. That was one thing that went in my favor during the cross-examination and the questioning. And I told them all the same details, that I didn't remember very much. I remember being assaulted. I remember feeling strange in this bar, and I remember somehow escaping this apartment in this rundown area of Dubai, which we later established was Naif. And coming out of that testimony and not being arrested felt like I'd been touched by God. I don't know how I was able to do that. And then the next day I had to go back to work and take calls from clients and produce events. So I think the mental strain was starting to tell on me. On other court dates that I attended when I heard witness testimony, which went right up until April 2013, apart from my housemate and the person whose keys I was collecting on the night, the taxi driver that picked me up from this bar also attended. And this is where the bombshell moments of the case became clear to me. So he testified that he picked me up from this bar and that I was in an inebriated state. He didn't mention drugs because officially there are no drugs in the UAE, but they knew that there was no alcohol in my system. That was never acknowledged by the court, that I was drugged. We just didn't discuss it at all. But the taxi driver said that I was semi-conscious in the back of his taxi, and that rather than take me to my villa in the Springs, he took me to JBR. Now, JBR was about a 25-30 minute drive from the bar, so I have no idea why we went there. And he said that he pulled over and that a car had been following us, and two men got out of this car and they said, oh, you know, we know her, she's drunk, don't worry, we'll take her. And this was also caught on CCTV. And I apparently got out of the taxi and I said, no, I don't know them, I'm not going with them. And these men then gave the taxi driver on camera 150 dirhams, which was 3 times what the taxi fare was. The taxi driver accepted the money and then refused to let me get back in the taxi. So this taxi driver knew full well that I didn't know these men, could see that I was semi-conscious from being drugged, and accepted, let's be honest, a bribe to look the other way while these men kidnapped me. So there's no duty of care, and this is a government taxi, this is an RTA taxi, and JBR is a really busy tourist area that would have had kids and families and all sorts around at that time of night. So he didn't care. He was quite happy to sell me off and get me out of his taxi. And I refused to get in the car with these men. Apparently at one point I actually tried to get in the driver's side of the taxi and basically said, I'm going to drive myself home if you're not going to take me, which sounds like something that my stubborn self would do. And amidst all of this, apparently the other man got out of the car and actually walked up to me and grabbed me around the waist, and then two of them physically dragged me into their car and drove off with me. And the taxi driver got back in his car and he drove off. So now it all became clear that I was physically kidnapped from a busy tourist destination. And a government taxi driver, an RTA taxi driver, had accepted a bribe on camera to just walk away and not report anything to the police. There was no duty of care, no humanity. And what kills me is that I tried to get to safety. I tried to get away from these men. I got out of the bar. I got into a taxi. And somehow these men followed the taxi and they still got to me. If I'd got into my villa in the Springs, which was a gated community, I would have been safe because this car that was following me wouldn't have been allowed, they wouldn't have been allowed to come in behind me. But no, the taxi driver decided to sell me for 150 dirhams. And the last thing that Dubai wants is headlines like British women being kidnapped from JBR. So that's the reason why the case was prosecuted. I think we'll leave it there for today. Thank you so much for listening. It's very cathartic for me to speak about these experiences and to share awareness about that part of the world. And if you want to hear more about this story, I'll be going to episode 4 next week. You can subscribe to this below. And I really hope that if something like this has happened to you, you find the strength to find your voice and complain about it and make the authorities listen to you. Because the only people that benefit when we sit in silence are the abusers. And the only thing that we can do is say it louder. Thank you.